Hello, friends. So, today I have a fun lesson for you. Another fun one. I know you come back for the fun. You can't deny it. So, this one is a big one, okay? It's a big, big concept. It's a big, kind of fuzzy, vague concept. It's one of those things that you probably won't get right away. You think you might understand it, but then something will shift your understanding. And until you really truly get it, until you practice it and see it, it might be very difficult to implement into your writing. So let's just talk about this and start this discussion and see where it unfolds for you in your writing. This may be something that you work at for quite a while, and I don't want you to feel bad about that or feel like, oh my gosh, I'm just not getting this, or what is the matter with me? This is something that everyone, believe me, everyone struggles with this in some way or another, okay? At some point in their writing, most likely in the beginning, we struggle with this. Even I mean, everyone. So this is something that is not necessarily easy for us to do. What is it? Show, don't tell. You've heard of it, right? I know you have. It's one of those phrases in the writing world that just follows writers around like a little ghost or a little rain cloud and won't go away, right? It's just this thing you hear people, especially in the fiction genre, that they struggle with and they're confused and not sure what to do with. And I think it greatly, greatly applies to memoir, not as much with traditional nonfiction, narrative nonfiction. Yes, when there's a narrative or a story, you want to be showing and not telling, or you're just going to bore your readers to sleep. So it is not uncommon for people to struggle with this. It can be a very tricky, challenging skill to hone, and even the phrase itself is a little confusing. So we're going to break this down. We're going to shed some light on what this is. I'm going to try to give you kind of the high notes and some examples. And I don't expect this to be the only time you go back and try to implement this in your writing, and maybe need a refresher. And just Google it. There are tons of blogs out there, and I can happily give you more resources. But know that this is a process. This is one of those skills that just takes practice, practice, practice until you get near perfect. Because in writing, there is no perfect, right? Okay, so show, don't tell. Here are the 6 or so things, I think there's 6, that I want to tell you about this that you need to know so you don't sit here and continually pull your hair out when you're trying to wrap your head around this concept. Number 1, show, don't tell does not mean that your book needs more flowery, descriptive, fancy words, okay? So for example, I have a couple written for you. Instead of saying, she was cold and put on her thick wool cotton blend sweater that hung past her hip line and came up a bit on her neck. It's not the best writing, okay, but you're getting what I'm saying, right? I'm like going into depth about this sweater. Instead of saying this, or when you say this, your readers are thinking, what's the deal with the sweater? Like, why do we need to know this detail, right? They might be cluing into the fact that you just spent, 85% of the words in that sentence on a sweater. This sweater is important. That's the message that you're sending to them. If that sweater and the way it sat on her body is truly not relevant to your story, but rather the point of that sentence was to describe how cold she was, then the description of that sweater was not needed. You went into the weeds, my friend. That is what I call it. You go too deep into the detail and you just get us lost in the weeds. Why do we care where this darn sweater got pulled down past her hip? Why do we necessarily care about that, or up on her neck? Well, in that context, what you may have been trying to describe is that this was like a warm sweater, right? This wasn't a chintzy little sweater. It was longer and taller, and, she put it on because she was cold. So instead of describing that thing with these descriptive words like cotton wool blend, no one cares about that, right? Let's just be honest. No one cares what the sweater is made out of unless the sweater is the actual point. But in this case, it's not. It's that she was cold. So instead, focus on the action. How you as a human could identify she was cold without her saying anything to you. How you saw her act or behave, what her body looked like, what her body did, what she said, of course, is relevant, but assuming she doesn't tell you she's cold, how would you have been able to see that? So that's what I want you to focus on when trying to show us that she was cold versus tell us, right? Because you had to learn this. In real life, people don't walk around and tell you every little thing that's happening with them. Like, for example, when you walk up to a coworker and like they're kind of pale and they're not looking real well, immediately you're like, hey, what's up with you? Like, do you feel well? And then most likely they're gonna be like, oh, I didn't sleep well last night. I'm real tired. But you visually saw this before they said anything. People don't just walk up like, hi, I'm Danielle, I'm tired today, right? So for example, in my example about the sweater, here is how you could turn this around. And of course, go along with me on this one. Her lips began turning a shade of blue I had never seen before as she desperately tried to get the sweater over her head, despite the deep shivers flashing through her body. So maybe a bit over dramatic, but I wanted to paint this picture for you. You saw the blue lips, right? You saw her just like struggling because she was shivering so hard trying to pull this thing over her body. Any person with a sense of sight that could see this scene unfold would deduct that this girl was cold. The sweater details, we didn't even talk about the sweater, right? Like, we didn't even talk about what the sweater looked like or was made out of or the shape of it. So that is point number 1. Point number 2, this does not require you to describe every little detail. You should only be focusing on what's relevant to the story. And I know we've talked about that, but I want to give you an example within this context. So, for example, if you are out walking your dog and the point of the scene is to kind of describe this moment where you have this, you're like in a mundane, like mindless task, and you have this aha thought, right? Some enlightenment just came upon you. This has probably happened to you, right? Like you go out for a walk and you're like, oh my gosh, that just hit me. Or you're like in the shower, you're doing dishes or doing something very mundane, right? You could tell the readers like, oh yeah, I had this thought, but instead you could actually describe when you had the thought and how the thought came upon you and where you were when this thought came upon you, because that context would make it feel more alive rather than just telling us about your thought process. So let's walk through this, okay? In this scene, you're walking your dog. You don't need to describe to us like every house you pass and all, oh, I went on this long walk through the neighborhood and it's like what all the neighbors are doing. I mean, you may set the scene for us and tell us you're on this walk. It's a cold, blustery day or whatever, right? Like you might set the scene a little bit, but you're not going to describe every tiny thing you see along your walk. Instead, you might describe the fact that you abruptly stopped in front of one particular house where you had this light bulb moment. It just stopped you in your tracks. And all of a sudden, your dog is tugging on the leash. Like, oh, you kind of jolted your dog out of his walk too, right? Like all of a sudden the train came to a stop and he's like, hello, like, let's keep going. And he tugs you and you kind of wake up out of it and you look around and you realize, well, the neighbor's staring at you. The neighbor who's out raking his yard is staring at you and looking a little concerned that you were just standing there frozen in time until your dog tugged hard enough to wake you up, right? So what that tells me as a reader is that this was a big thought. This was an important thought, important moment, something that stops you in your tracks as your brain puts all of its energy to processing what you just thought versus moving its body. That's big, right? And the fact that you are jolted out of it by your dog tugging on the leash, that's kind of a very descriptive way to say it. And then you look over and you're like, oh, there's Jim, the neighbor, like staring at me. And there may be something about this neighbor that you had experienced before, like the creepy guy or the one who yells at you for parking on the wrong side of the road in the winter storm warning or whatever, right? Whatever. Like there might be a little thing that connects, that makes Jim, the neighbor, come alive a little bit. And you might describe that he's raking his leaves and he's giving you this look, right? You might describe the look he's giving you and you realize you were like in this trance, but those are relevant details. What the other people on the other side of the road are doing that you really didn't look at, or how many cars drove by, or what kind of cars drove by, or anything, right? Those are irrelevant details. So they may have happened in the scene, but they don't matter. Jim doesn't really matter to your story, but his presence allows you to illustrate. Instead of telling us, it allows you to illustrate how big this moment was and how big that thought was. So think about these things as you go by. Like, were you stuck at a red light and someone's honking behind you? Well, you could say someone's honking behind me, or you could say the big Chevy 4x4, laid on his horn for 30 seconds before I came out of this trance, right? The Chevy 4x4. So it gives us different visual. This person might be more aggressive than a little, sweet old lady behind the wheel of a minivan going beep, beep. So be picky about the details. Don't hold back when they're relevant, like your dog's reaction and how many times he tugged. Did it take you 10 tugs or whatever? But be picky, be judicious. I like that word because it implies to me that you are being the judge of what is important, and that means you care about your readers. So point number 3, the show don't tell phrase means, it's better described as a phrase that means help the reader experience the moments as if they were in your shoes. So it's like, take a walk in my shoes. So show don't tell, think about it like that. You're putting the readers like into your shoes and you're like, let's go, lady. Let's go, reader. That means you must describe your senses, what you hear, feel, see, smell, taste. We have more than 5, 6 senses, okay? We have like a good dozen or more, right? According to some sources. So there are so many things going on within your body at any given moment, and so many things that your body is picking up as it's basically a data processing machine, that when you put us in that moment as a reader, we're like, oh, we're there. Like, we feel this, This is the type of description that helps your reader experience your story and not just read a bunch of stuff. Not just read about a bunch of random neighbors in red sweaters, right? So you want your readers to feel that moment with you because you want them to feel what you felt. I would be willing to bet, and I'm not a betting woman, I would be willing to bet that you have read a book that has made you cry. And you may not be able to recall exactly the moment that jerked your tears, but I'd be willing to place another bet that it was because that author helped you feel something, that you felt what that author felt in that moment, and you were moved by it, emotionally moved by it. Their ability to show you through their eyes and their heart and their ears and their hands and all of that, right? That portrayed to you the deep moment, that deep connection, that deep meaning that was in that moment. Without any of that, without any of their description and senses and how they were feeling and all that, they were just telling you the hard stuff that they went through that day or that year or whatever it was, right? They're not giving you a lot to go on. If I told you like, hey, I can't even think of a good bad example. Like, oh, hey, my son died, right? Like, you're not, and he didn't, by the way, bad example, but like, hey, my son died. He was killed in a car crash. You might be like, oh my gosh, that's horrible, but you're not going to burst out crying. I have to give you the details and the feeling and how horrible this was for me to learn this and get this phone call in the middle of the night and blah, 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 right? Like, I have to go into that. So yes, feel into it. Tell us how the air felt on your shoulder as it brushed your hair, whatever, right? Like, tell us about those moments that speak to you in your memory. How these things stick to you inside is how they're going to stick to your readers. How loud was that scream that just shook you to your core? Don't just say she screamed or the thing, whatever, right? Like, the noise happened. Well, okay, what about that scream was so impactful that you had to put it in your book, right? So make sure you're portraying your emotional senses and your physical sensations. Those inside-outside perspective is important. And that brings me to my next point. Let us into your mind/heart. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see from readers. They just tell us what happened on the outside of them, and they're describing the scenes really well and all of that, but they're not letting us in. They're not letting us hear their inner dialogue and their thoughts and how they're processing and, why the scene matters to them, why the scene matters to the story. If we don't know why it matters to you, why are we going to care about it? And then because you're helping your reader along on that journey, remember the reader's journey from point A to point B, the arc of change, it's really important for them to see how you internally processed these things as they were happening. And this means making sure that you tell us and give due respect to how you felt in that moment and how you thought about things in that moment back then, not now as a narrator, back then. Because yes, you may have evolved in your thinking, and you may have come to believe or feel something totally different about that situation than when you were in it, right? We do that. We grow up, we evolve, we look back and we're like, oh, okay, I was young and immature back then, but now I feel like this. Don't do that. We need to feel how you got from here to here, right? So make sure that you're focused in on how you felt and processed in that emotion or in that moment, your emotion in that moment, so that we also are connected to that moment. Okay, number 5 maybe? I lost track. Just let's roll with it. Next point. So take some common words and break them down. When you're sad, you don't just cry, right? Sometimes those tears trickle out slowly, and sometimes they burn your eyes, and sometimes they just come so fast you can't stop them, and sometimes they cool down your hot cheeks because your cheeks are hot with anger or embarrassment, right? Like, I could just tell you I cried, but if I don't tell you how the tears came, you may not understand what kind of cry I am meaning. So instead of I cried, expand that. And another example, I sat down. Okay, did you just sit, or did you plunk, or did you straddle the edge of your seat in anticipation, or did you sink deeply in your chair in relaxation, with this kind of like air of luxury, like, oh my gosh, this chair is the most comfortable thing ever, I'm never moving, right? So and what does the seat feel like, and what is it, a squeaky leathery thing or a soft plushy thing, and what does it smell like? I mean, if that moment is important enough for you to say, like, I sat down, tell us how you sat, or maybe what you sat on. That may or may not be relevant, right? But don't just say, like, I sat down and we began talking. Like, I plunked down tells us a little bit of, like, how you may have abruptly just kind of like, ugh, whatever, I'm here. Let's get this over with. Okay, so I think this is my last point here. I'm looking at my notes. So with all this said, this doesn't mean that you can't tell in your book, okay? I know it says show, don't tell. And again, this is why I say that term is a little confusing, but you can tell and you should tell. You should actually do both. You just shouldn't do both about the same thing. You don't really need to do that, right? Some things need to be shown. Some things are very important and we focus on them and we should show them to the readers and we should paint that picture of that scene and that action and those moments. But sometimes you just need to tell them the things so they are on the same page with you, metaphorically. And, take backstory, for example. If you showed us your first 25 years before your story started, I mean, you'd have like a 1,000,000-word long book. It would be ridiculous, right? It would be ridiculous. And for that matter, you probably wouldn't remember half of the stuff that happened in those 25 years anyway, right? So it's a dramatic example, but it makes a point, right? That maybe there was something that happened over a period of time, and instead of delving into what happened in that period of time that sort of is offset from your timeline. So for example, your timeline, spans these 3 years, right? And maybe there's like 3 months in there that really isn't on your timeline. It just happened in those 3 years, and maybe you took a trip or something. For example, let me give you a real example here. You meet a boy, you fall in love, and you leave for the summer, and he stays back, and, of course, we all know long distance relationships are tricky. But you come back and things are different, right? You don't need to tell us all the things that happened when you were gone for the summer, like where you went or who you were with and all of the, water skiing you did on your vacation, right? That doesn't matter. The story is the boy you fell in love with and coming back and things feel different. And I would argue that it actually is what didn't happen in those 3 months that is much more relevant. So that is what you're alluding to there, that you weren't there and you didn't foster that relationship and somehow things shifted even though you didn't do anything to shift them, right? So those 3 months, not relevant. You just sort of sum it up. Hey, I went away for the summer and I came back. Something to that effect, right? A couple lines. I spent the summer in Greece and I came back and Tony was totally different. So you tell us that. You just tell us, like, I was gone for a while and I came back. And maybe when you come back, the scene that you introduce is the first reconnection with this lover of yours, and you describe and show us how it felt different. But that summer in Greece, while it may be memorable and fun, is irrelevant to this love story in a way that you need to deeply dive into it. So, I know this is a long one. I'm sorry. This is a big topic. I considered breaking it up into a couple of videos, but I think this is a good crash course. And you can kind of jump into looking at your current book or going forward writing with a different eye towards, am I showing, am I telling, and what can I do to adjust this? So just be okay with the fact that this won't come very naturally, and you may not know exactly when to show and exactly when to tell, and this may take some practice and many revisions, and we'll talk about the editing process next month. So just start by getting your story out, and you can always go back and review for this. If it's something you feel stuck on while you're writing, just skip over it. We don't need to, you don't need to stress this during the active writing phase. This can be more of one of those editing techniques. But just imagine, while you're writing or while you're editing, how these things felt and what you want your readers to feel. And that will help you kind of determine, do they need to feel something about this 3-month stint No, they need to feel something about how different it was when I came back from that little vacation. So, all right, I'm done. And let me know what you think about this. This is a discussion I want to have. Do you feel like this is a skill you've nailed, a skill you just are so confused on? Did I raise any more confusion? What can I clear up for you? What examples can I give you, or what passages in your work can I give you some feedback on? Let me know. I'm here for you, and together we'll show and also tell sometimes.